Hello and welcome to episode 211 of The Dive Down, a Magic the Gathering podcast focused on the latest decks, trends, and strategies for the casual spike. My name is Dave here in Chicago, and Shane's not here, and Stan's not here, and I am all alone in my basement.
All by myself.
Except we do have someone here to save us from, I don't even know what 2 hours of me alone would sound like. We are lucky to have Devon O'Donnell, a.k.a. d00mwake, back with us today, fresh off of his trip to Pro Tour, to MagicCon Philadelphia, to be a part of all the Pro Tour festivities. Devon, how's it going? How's your trip?
It was good. Glad to be back, Dave. Had a little bit of, maybe not the best sleep over the weekend, but I think I slept for like 12 hours last night. So that felt pretty good. The drive wasn't too bad going, back and forth. It was like I was talking to you. It was about a 4.5 hour drive both ways, maybe a little added for traffic, but yeah, it was great. The food was by far the best part of the trip. We actually stayed with one of my friends is a professional chef, so he knows all the good places to go. So we had some really good food over the weekend.
Wow. Can you drop the number one thing that you ate over the weekend? Can you even choose?
It's a tie between Herschel's and Angelo's.
Okay. What were those?
Herschel's was the pastrami. It was like we got pastrami sandwich from Herschel's. That's the one that's in the market. And then Angelo's was like a steak and cheese place. You would not believe it when we went into we walked in because they actually suggested that we order 45 minutes ahead of time just for a steak and cheese. And I kid you not, when we walked in, it was like it was packed wall to wall. There was a line of at least 20 people outside. It was unbelievable. But it was worth the wait.
Those places, as much as I want to hate on the places where you have to wait in line, I mean, because there's a lot of those here in Chicago too. Like, they're always worth it. It's like you just maybe don't have the time. But I'm really disappointed by the food when there's like a crowd there waiting for every day. So, well, that's awesome. I have not been to Philly too much. I did a couple of business trips there a few years back. It's a cool town. But yeah, it's been a couple of years. Definitely not since we hit pandemic world. Anyway. We're happy to have you back and awesome to get your perspective on what happened to the Pro Tour and talk a little bit about what you did at MagicCon. So on this week's show, what we're going to do, number one, I just want everybody to know, listeners, this is our last week where we're going to be focusing on Pioneer as much as we have been lately in the lead up to the Pro Tour, So all you modern stands out there, don't worry, we're not becoming just a Pioneer podcast, but there is one more week to talk about it. And I think the results are pretty cool. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about a bunch of takes that I had and that Devon had maybe from going to and viewing Pro Tour Philadelphia. We're going to talk about, what our reactions were. We're going to try to do that to kind of mix it up from a normal just meta breakdown. We're going to try to talk a little bit about what might stick, what might not stick, and where Pioneer might go from here. And then, of course, after covering the Pro Tour, just because I don't know why Wizards did this, but we have spoilers to talk about somehow from March of the Machine. Did you have any idea that was going to happen yesterday?
No idea. We haven't even been a week, not even a week and a half out of Phyrexia. We already got spoilers for the next set. So, I kind of wish they would maybe give us a little more time to breathe in the new set. But, I'm always down for previews. So.
Yeah, at least it's not coming out for 6 weeks. That's the one thing I would remind people is that this really was the first look. And there's some interesting stuff to talk about. It might be more flavorish, so we don't have a long list of cards to go over. But, we'll throw that at the end as a little bit of a dessert at the end of this long discussion about Pro Tour Philly and Pioneer. But first, a little bit of housekeeping. We have new patrons, Sean G., and I believe another patron named Mr. Mac Attack might have snuck in at the last minute. So I thank you both for your support. We don't have any new reviews right now. So please, if you would consider hopping over to iTunes or Spotify, give us some stars, give us a review. We'd really appreciate it. It helps people find the show, helps us feel better about ourselves, and helps our wives understand why we do this work every week. If you want to support us directly, you can go to patreon.com/thedivedown to check out the different tiers that we have available for support. The biggest one that we always tell people about is that $1 a week gets you access to our Discord, where there's a really good group of people who have been part of our Patreon for a long time. They're welcoming to new players, kind of talking about decks constantly and other stuff too. So come and check it out, patreon.com/thedivedown. If you want to support us without any technocrats getting a hold of any of your money, you can go check out thedivedown.com/store, check out some merch. We got hats, we got fanny packs, we got, I don't even remember now, all kinds of different stuff. But go check it out if you want to represent us at game stores or tournaments near you.
The Rhino shirts.
Yes, Rhino shirts. Rhino shirts are the best seller. It's really funny to see the, on Squarespace, that's where our website is. You can see the analytics in the background. And so it's like the page views for every piece of product is like around one number. And then the Rhino shirt views is like 15 times as many views. It's really funny. Like that's the only one that people care about. Check out the Rhino shirt. Last couple of things here. Our longtime sponsor and partner, manatraders.com, where you can rent Magic online cards for you to play. You can use code THEDIVEDOWN10 to get 10% off your first 2 months of card rentals. That's manatraders.com. Barrister and Man, our skincare, grooming, soap, everything kind of partner. You can get 15% off your first order from Barrister and Man at The Dive Down with the code THEDIVEDOWN15. Help Will out if you can. And finally, if you want a little bonus just for being a listener, go check out Nerd Rage Gaming. We were the official podcast of the Nerd Rage Championship Series last year. Hope to help them out again this year. But if you go use code DIVE8 at checkout, you'll get 8% off what you buy from them. All right, and that's it for the plugs. Devin, that's a lot of plugs, isn't it?
It's a lot of plugs, but you got to pay the bills, right?
Exactly. Again, we have to explain it to our wives. So let's dive in. Pro Tour Phyrexia. So like I said in the intro, we're going to do a little bit of a kind of like I'm going to present an argument to Devin and then going to see if he buys or sells it. A little bit is the idea. We might fall off of the theme as we get into the discussion, but we wanted to try to put together something that wasn't just a normal kind of like meta breakdown, talk about through the day and all that kind of stuff. So we just want to give you the takeaways. We had kind of about a dozen thoughts that I think people can consider as they consider how to think about Philadelphia.
What if I buy everything?
If you buy everything, then I'm going to feel really good about myself. I'm gonna go upstairs after this and have a nice pint of ice cream and go to sleep a happy grandpa. So we talked a little bit about the gathering for you already with your food, what you get to check out as far as food goes. What was the magic like for you at Pro Tour Philly? So I know that you weren't in the Pro Tour this time, still potentially working towards that in the future at different points in time. But I know that you played some cards. What was interesting to you? What were you trying to do? Did you have any goals?
Goals specifically, not really. I guess the one goal I really wanted to qualify for the Secret Lair Showdown thing is what it was called. So basically, to give a small breakdown, there were 4 qualifier events. The top 8 of each of those events qualified for the Secret Lair finals. And then just for basically getting to that finals, you got the Secret Lair rag event. I don't know if you saw it on Twitter, but it looks really nice. So
it's amazing. Yeah, I saw where that came from. I saw the pictures. I didn't realize where it came from. So that's where those cards were coming from, huh?
Yep. And then I don't know if you saw the winner as well got a Secret Lair Brainstorm foil, which apparently is only one of 4. And I guess they're doing 4, like one for each Pro Tour. So apparently that Brainstorm there's only 4 of those in the world, and I can't even begin to imagine how much that would be. But yeah, past that was Pioneer. I played one of those qualifiers. I played the Pro Tour they had Pro Tour qualifiers on Friday and Saturday, so I did Pro Tour qualifier on Friday and then the Pioneer qualifier on Saturday. The Pro Tour qualifier was Phyrexia sealed. My pool was pretty good. Ended up kind of bombing out a little bit. Lost to the same rare a couple of times. And then had a couple rough matchups I played Boats in the Saturday Pioneer qualifier. Had a couple of rough beats there, so I ended up 0-2 dropping. But I played a ton of drafts, did a lot of side drafts throughout the weekend because I'm a really big fan of the draft format for Phyrexia. And I just had a great time overall.
So I was going to ask you, because I saw that you were playing limited. We're not limited podcast, but just for my own curiosity. So a lot of people have been complaining about this draft format. It's too fast, et cetera, et cetera. What do you think what's your take on it after playing it for a while and if you're coming out liking it?
Oh, it's fast, but I like fast. I'm a big fan. I don't know if I posted a draft deck on Twitter the other day, or earlier today, excuse me. The Boros like uncommon equipment. That was like the 3 mana 2/2 double strike equipment. I had 4 of those. And
4?
I had 4 of them. It was the easiest 7 wins of my life. But yeah, the format's really fast.
Wow.
But I like that. I really like aggressive formats because it's really a lot more about combat, attacking, blocking, combat tricks, and you have to be aware of all the combat tricks, and there's a lot of them in the format. So I think for me personally, I actually enjoy that gameplay a lot more than like the 5-color soup kind of formats.
I totally agree. It's so funny for you to say that because I don't know if you know, but I used to be. So when I came back to Magic, I only played Limited for about 10 years. And that was all I did. And I went to like GPs and played Sealed and stuff like that, but I never made a constructed deck until Shane got into playing Magic. And then we both started getting into Standard and a little bit of constructed. But the set that I came back to in Limited was Zendikar. Original Zendikar, which classically fast. And then some of my favorite sets were honestly my favorite to play. Ixalan is one of the ones where I had my highest Magic Online rating ever, basically, along with Kaladesh, both of which were not known for being slow formats. Kaladesh was maybe a little bit slower, but Ixalan was sort of like 2-drop plus a combat trick and hold on for dear life, which I really enjoy too.
Territorial Hammer Skull, baby.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I was just trying to think of the name of the 1-mana vampire trick that gave what did it give, first strike to a vampire if you used it? It was like +2/+2 and gave first strike. That card was absurd.
That card was great, yeah.
Yeah. All right. Maybe we can do a bonus episode about Limited sometime. But awesome. So you played boats. How did you end up? Did you end up? We kind of heard how it went, but what configuration did you go with? Just out of curiosity, given what we talked about last week.
So when I actually saw it was Shutter MTG. I think her name is Ash Johnson on Twitter. I saw her post her PT list, and it looks really interesting. There was 3 main deck Bank Busters, no Lovestruck Beast, and I love it just looked like a really solid shell. So I was going to play that. I played in a side event on Friday as kind of preparation for the Saturday qualifier. I lost to Rakdos twice. And you can imagine if you're adding Reckoner Bankbuster to your main deck and still losing to Rakdos twice, then you're probably doing something wrong. I don't know if it was just,
That's
variance, but yeah, I ended up going back to the other version. The version that I played was, I think, 2 Luca main, 2 Miglaws, and then a 3rd Luca in the sideboard with no swords. Is what I played.
Cool. Yeah, and you felt like that. Do you still feel okay about that kind of configuration going forward? Do you think you can make some changes? Or
if creativity is going to really pick up in popularity, I think Luca might be maybe more relegated to the sideboard because it's kind of sketchy as like a 5-mana play in that matchup, and Boat's already not that great. So depending on, we'll talk about the metagame over the PT, depending on how that shakes up the format, I think Luca might be more of relegated to the sideboard, but Miglaw is still really good.
Awesome. Good to know. Still regretting that I refused to talk about that card just because it is a silly name earlier, but I got over it. Card's just good. All right. So number one thing, the take we're going to start with, I think is the most milquetoast take of the entire tournament, perhaps, but that is that the top of the registered Pioneer meta was basically exactly as we would expect. And that's, when I say the top of the meta, I'm talking about the top 53% of the meta was split between 5 decks. And I bet that everybody listening to this podcast, I'm sure you could have, in the dark, guessed exactly what these 5 decks were. So I'm going to read it off really quick. So Rakdos Midrange was number 1 with 15.1%. Mono Green Devotion was number 2 with 13.7%. Gruul Vehicles, 9.6%. Lotus Field Combo, 7.8%. Mono White Humans, 6.8%. That is 53% of the meta, as I mentioned, between 5 decks that we're all extremely, extremely familiar with.
Yeah, I mean, this is, we talked about it last week. This is essentially, I think if we, I pretty much predicted this exactly with the swapping of Lotus Field and Gruul. I maybe honestly, it's a little bit lower than what I initially thought, because I think when we talked last week, I said, 20 Rakdos, 15 green. So I think there were maybe a little bit less Rakdos players, but roughly about what we expected. I personally thought Lotus Field would be more represented than Gruul Vehicles, but a little pleasant surprise, and Mono White coming in 5th. But yeah, like you said, just this is the decks to beat. This is going to be the top of the metagame, and I don't really think much is gonna change these top 5. I mean, metagame shifts and stuff like that, but these are the 5 best decks.
Do you think that? So one thing that I was looking at when I was looking at this top 3 list was like, okay, if you were coming into this tournament and you knew for sure, and a lot of people did know for sure with high degree of confidence, let's say Rakdos mid-range, Monogreen Devotion, Gruul Vehicles, plus or minus, like that's the top 3 decks. Is Lotus Field the deck that you pick to go into a field that you know is going to be like 40-ish% or 35%, those other 3 decks? Or do you think that that's not really a great matchup for that deck, and it's just because Lotus Field is intrinsically powerful on its own that it still ends up in this tier?
So I like Lotus Field against Gruul. I like it a decent amount against Rakdos. It's a little bit sketchier against Green. The thing about Lotus Field is it's incredibly. I think I don't know if you saw this article from Paulo a couple weeks ago, but there was an article that Paulo wrote where it's like the hardest decks to play in Pioneer, and he had Lotus Field. I'm pretty sure he had Lotus Field as number 1, and Lotus Field is. Once you know the combo lines, it's not the hardest deck to execute the combo, but there's a lot of spots where if your opponent has specific hate pieces, like how to play around Damping Sphere, how to play around Narset, how to play around, Pithing Needle on Thespian Stage, there's a lot of counterplay to the combo. And I think maybe if you had a lot of experience and a lot of preparation with Lotus Field, as we saw a lot of the top, like one of the best Lotus Field players who did well in the event was Nathan Stoyer, who's the world champion. Yeah. He's incredibly good at Magic. Right. So I think that's, and I think I saw Joel Lissette top 16 or top 32 with Lotus Field. I think he went X and 5 or X and 6. So yeah,
I'm pretty sure he was top 16. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And these dedicated Lotus Field players, these are, they're really good players. But yeah, I think it's a fine choice if you know what you're doing at the end of the day.
Yeah. Well, I think we'll come back to that, I think, in the next point, actually, about it being a fine choice if you know what you're doing. And then the 5th deck, to me, so Mono White was still a little bit of a surprise to me that there would be this many players that would show up with basically just the fast aggro deck in the field, especially at a Pro Tour. I kind of feel like decks like that get underrepresented in fields like this. And, like we talked about last week, I think Control tends to get overrepresented in fields like this. How do you think it ended up being that Mono White had basically as many people as Lotus Field to kind of still sneak into that top 5? Just because it's really good?
I think a lot of the people who played Mono White probably expected a lot more Lotus Field. I think they kind of predicted what we predicted, where it would be, Rakdos, MGD, and then 3rd Lotus Field, and then Gap, Gruul Vehicles. Because if you expected more Gruul than Lotus Field, Mono White's probably not the best choice. Mono White is traditionally not that great against Gruul. But it has a good matchup against Lotus Field, a slightly, we'll say maybe 60%-ish against Mono Green. We'll look at the win rates later. I think if those are the two decks that you're targeting, then Mono White was a good choice. And, given the actual spread of the metagame, it probably ended up doing worse than what people expected because Gruul was more represented than Lotus Field.
Yep. All right. But this is just the facts, right? I mean, this is what people thought was going to be here. This is the canvas that the story of the weekend got painted against in a weird kind of way, right? So let's talk about the thing that was actually surprising about this. So our next take here is that the thing that was actually surprising about this top 50% of the meta was that its performance was not good, I think you could probably say, overall. And I think it's nuanced because when you have decks that get up to be 15% of the field, weird things start to happen. But once we got a look at the non-mirror, non-buy win rates from a couple of different people, including C. Marty on Reddit and Dr. Frank Karsten, here's what the win rates from those 5 decks looked like. So Rakdos Mid was 46.43%. Monogreen Devotion was 46.63%. Gruul Vehicles was 47.4%. Lotus Field was 52.68%, but it was also only 47% after day 1, so I think that the fact that 4 players carried Lotus Field into the top 16 really buffed that win rate kind of in day 2. And then Mono White Humans, shockingly 36.2% win rate. And then finally, the combined win rates from this top half of the meta was 46%. Like, so I went back through and added up all the wins and losses of all these decks. 46% was what these decks look like. That's like really mediocre.
Wow, that's kind of crazy. When you think about that, for the top half of the metagame, they won less than half of their matches. That's just not how the numbers would normally work out. Yeah, that's kind of crazy. I think a lot of that has to do with, I think, we'll talk about this after, but the rise in creativity, because the issue with, I think, specifically if you look at all these decks, Rakdos, Mono Green, Gruul, and okay, yeah, maybe those three definitely have a rough creativity matchup. Lotus Field, Mono White are maybe a little bit closer. But yeah, I think that might have to do with it, because there was the entire team that played creativity there. I think pretty sure their team did very extremely well. Mm-hmm. And I think that's part of it. Is maybe it's just, it's one of those things where maybe the people that played this like top half of the metagame, they were probably just, maybe they picked their deck on raw power level and not necessarily like as much. Pioneer's weird because you can metagame for, like, let's say you go all in on some Rakdos mid-range sideboard cards, and then you end up you play against like less Rakdos, more mono green, then that could kind of skew the percentages as well. So maybe these decks are either, maybe they tried to pick a very specific metagame and they got that choice and they just were off a little bit, mm-hmm. or they tried to have a sideboard that was more well-rounded, and because of that, they're sacrificing card quality in other matchups. So that those are two things to think about here.
Yeah, I think you're bringing up the and no spoilers, because of course we're going to talk about creativity. It was the deck that won the tournament in the hands of a Hall of Famer, but we'll get to that in a little bit. But the interesting thing about the matchup splits with creativity, and can I just say I love that Wizards kind of somewhat sanctioned putting this data out there, because like they used to ask people to take this kind of stuff down, right? But now it's their writer putting it up on his Twitter channel. They must know that he's going, or his Twitter feed, they must know that he's going to do it. So I appreciate this for sure. The matchup splits on creativity are pretty interesting, actually. So Is It Creativity went 6-13 against Rakdos. So it only had a 33% win rate against Rakdos, but it was 7-5 against Mono Green Devotion, so 58% there. 12-4 against Boats, 75% win rate against Boats, and it went 6-2 against Lotus Field combo, and 3-1 against Mono White Humans. That's pretty wild to be, 60% plus against every deck that's not Rakdos. Even though Rakdos is the biggest deck in the room, I mean, you make up a lot of ground either by dodging matchups, because it's only 15%, and then picking up all these other points from all these other decks is pretty interesting.
Yeah, like if you think about it from a numbers perspective, even if you expect to play against Rakdos 15% of the time, so 15 out of 100, we'll say that's 15, like 1 in 6 matches, mm-hmm. 1 in 7 matches roughly. So I mean, if you're only average to play against Rakdos 1.5 times in the tournament, and you just accept those L's, you're still going to go 8-2 in the constructed portion.
Right.
You know what I mean? Yeah. So it's like, even if you give up one matchup, as long as you to make up the percentage points enough in those other matchups, then that's totally fine, even if it's the most played deck.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's funny that you say this, because there were some people in our Aaron and a couple other people in our Discord today. We're actually having this exact same conversation about a different deck. So it's funny that you bring up the exact same thing Aaron was trying to say, which is like, it's okay to punt against the most popular deck if you feel like you really are gaining a bunch of points against all the other decks that are out there. But still shocking with that this half of the meta did this badly. And, I took some questions from listeners for you today, since we knew, last week we didn't tell anybody that we were gone. We wanted to be a surprise. Hey, Doomwake's on. Everybody get excited. This week I let people know that you were coming back, and a couple of people asked questions. One of our listeners, Van Gogh is their screen name in Discord, asked, is mono green overrated? And my question actually is, are all of these decks overrated? Or do you think any of these decks are overrated? Like, is this just what happens sometimes to the most popular decks in the room?
Yeah, well, especially at a Pro Tour.
Yeah.
It's like a lot of these teams will, you saw the super team of like, I remember exactly everybody, I pulled up the photo, but it was like Reed, Siggy, LSV, just all these
Gabe
like...
Nassif.
Yeah, Gabe Nassif, Martin Juza, all these like incredibly skilled, incredibly talented people. When you put all of these minds together, they're looking at all different types of data, like recent win rates and recent challenge results, and all of these things that they're using to predict a metagame. And it's all about, like, if you predict the metagame right, and in this case, because I think that's why you see a lot of these low win rates with these top 5 decks, is because everybody was prepared for them.
Yeah.
You know, it's a lot of people want to complain about like Fable and Rakdos midrange or Nykthos and stuff like that in mono green. It's like, you know, I think if you put in these results are really show that if you put in the work and you put in, you know, the numbers and you want to beat these decks, you definitely can.
Yeah. So what we're saying as far as Van Gogh's question goes is these decks are probably properly rated, right? It's as far as it goes.
Yeah,
it's just you can fight them in a controlled environment, and if you have the time to do the metagaming, you can do it. But these decks probably aren't overrated or underrated. They're popular for a reason. They're generally good. All right, so let's take a look at the next kind of quartile of our results, because they broke out kind of nicely in this way. So our third kind of headline about the tournament or take is, you know, if the top of the meta was fully stock, I actually think the next quartile, the next 25%, was almost equally stock, except their results were surprising. And, you know, I put in here in the headline, it was like, we should all immediately start playing these decks. I don't know if that's true. But the next 25% of the meta is Azorius Control with 6.4%, Rakdos Sacrifice with 6.4%, Is It Creativity with 6.4%, and Is It Phoenix with 5.0%. I'm going to give you the win rates before we get into the thoughts generally. Blue-White Control was 55.4% win rate. Rakdos Sacrifice was 55.7%. Is It Creativity 55.7%. Is It Phoenix 55.6%. Now, these are not like world beating. You know, having a 55% win rate in a Pro Tour is not, I mean, it is positive and it looks great compared to the decks that we looked at just now. But what do you think about people selecting these decks? We already talked about creativity a little bit, but so maybe let's talk about Azorius Control, Rakdos Sacrifice, and Is It Phoenix quickly before we get back to creativity.
Yeah, so I mean, all 4 of these decks, these are kind of like the metagame calls. You know, not necessarily going to be the top of the top, not as much as what people expected, but based on the actual expected metagame, that these can have a good enough matchup against a lot of those decks. Like, for example, Azorius Control, good against boats, goodish against mono green, good against mono white, so on and so forth. You can talk about all these different decks. The thing that honestly surprises me the most is the Phoenix win rate, because I was kind of under the assumption that Phoenix is never really ever going to be a dead deck. There's a contingency of players that really enjoy playing it, but it's just surprising to me that it did so well, because in my experience with Phoenix, I don't know if you played a decent amount of Phoenix or Pioneer, but my experience, it feel like it was never that great against Rakdos, and I was always like, feel like I was a coin flip against green. And those being the 2 most popular matchups, I'm kind of surprised it did so well, but maybe they had a good enough plan for the matchup.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I generally, and I have very small sample sizes. I don't get to play as many games as most people, right? But Is It Phoenix, and also I spread out what I'm playing so much to talk about on the show, but when I played Phoenix in Pioneer, for what it's worth, I always felt kind of okay against Rakdos, but definitely bad against mono green. I mean, similar to the way that I felt like Is It Phoenix was bad against Tron in Modern, like it's equally true here, because they just go over the top and then you're done. Like, and that's just it. But I do think that the thing that was most surprising to me is just Phoenix felt like it was getting unpopular because of how much Lotus Field there was. And we still had, 11 people, which is sort of close to the same number of people that brought Lotus Field. 17 people brought Lotus Field, 11 brought Is It Phoenix, even though all those Is It players probably thought there was going to be a lot of Lotus Field here. Interestingly, didn't really see anything new in that deck and any of those decks, really, which I thought was kind of fascinating. It's not like they changed their configuration to try to fight the metagame from what I could tell. The last thing I would say that was interesting before we get back to Is It Creativity is that even though these decks all had good win rates, none of them top aided. And they were only medium close to top aiding. Like the highest one from this list, so Marcio Carvalho came in 11th with Rakdos Sacrifice. Jean-Emmanuel Depraz came in 13th with Is It Phoenix. So they're kind of like in that top 16 area, but they didn't quite get that last win to be able to make it. Of course, the loss that they might have come in draft. So, sometimes it's tough when you look at this kind of like final rankings to be able to figure out exactly how well their constructed deck carried them. But yeah.
Yeah, because the final record includes, for those of you who don't know, the final record includes all the 10 constructed rounds and the 6 limited rounds. So somebody who went 11-5, we don't necessarily know what exactly their constructed record was. So yeah, it's a good point.
Yeah, it is here on MTG Melee, but I'm not going to dive into it because we got lots of other stuff to talk about. But by the way, MTG Melee, amazing to be able to have this data as well. It's all stuff that like we just didn't have when I started playing Magic 10 years ago.
Website is so good. It's just, it gives you everything. It shows the archetype breakdown, their win rates, all that kind of stuff. So yeah, big shout out to Melee.
Yeah. So let's go back to creativity, because it did seem like creativity was in particular the darling of this tournament. As we said, it won the tournament. Team Channel Fireball brought it, which is probably the team with the most Pro Tour experience. Definitely the team with the most Hall of Famers. We kind of talked a little bit about how they might have been able to ascertain that it was good against all the other decks and not that great about Rakdos. Do you think that there was anything else that chose them to, or led them to choose playing this deck? Or what do you think about this as a choice for a team full of pros?
I think so I see on the notes here you put boomers just like to play Splinter Twin. I guess I like that note, which honestly at the end of the day, this is a deck, and people like those kinds of decks for a reason. They're combo control decks. So the creativity deck has a very robust combo plan. It's very consistent at setting up a turn 5 creativity for Xenagos and Worldspine Worm. So you have that like threat of, your opponent can never tap out because you always have that, similar to what Splinter Twin had. And then you also just have this really good control game plan. You have Shark Typhoons, you have Mutavaults, you have Fable of the Mirror Breaker. All of these cards just provide a ton of advantage. And they just allow you to play these like different games. It gives you more agency over the course of the game. You can like pivot to one plan. I know you talk a lot about like Hammer, you're trying to go on one plan and then you pivot to the next one. It's very similar here where you're like, I'm on the beatdown plan, but then, now I can't, they're stopping my beatdown plan. So now we have to pivot to plan B, what's plan C, stuff like that. Right. So yeah, I mean, and the nice thing about creativity is I don't really think outside of Azorius Control, which is a rough matchup, I will say that. But outside of that, I think the matchups against the rest of and Azorius Control isn't in the top 5, but I think the matchup against the top 5, I think are pretty good for the creativity deck. And one last thing I will say, I ran into Siggy at the PT, and we caught up a little bit. And he was, mentioning that he had watched my stream and he was watching me play creativity. And that's where he started playing it. And then he's convinced everybody else to play it. So I don't want to toot my own horn a little bit, but
wow,
I might have had a part.
No, I'm willing to give you all that credit. I think you should call Reed Duke. I know he lives on the East Coast somewhere as well. And at least the guy could buy you dinner. That's hilarious. And that's the kind of content you only get from the Dive Down when Devon is on. So there you go. So which of these decks would you try again? That is, are you believing in creativity? Are there any of these that you're interested in, or what, like, of this tier, is that just clearly the most powerful one to you, or what do you think?
Creativity for sure. I've played a ton of this deck. I think I made a couple deep challenge runs with it. Been tearing up the local F&M scenes with it.
Nice.
But yeah, I just think it's, again, as we talked about, it's like the deck that gives you a lot of agency. It really allows you to pivot from all these different types of plans. You can have like different sideboard creativity targets. I know they played Hullbreaker Horde, but people have experimented with Dream Trawler against Rakdos and all these different like Void Winnower against Mono Green. You can do a lot of different customization with your creativity targets. But yeah, I think creativity is here to stay. I would not be surprised if over the next couple of weeks we saw kind of like if you look at the challenge and league results, I would not be surprised if creativity maybe moved up a couple of spots and maybe snuck into that top 5.
Yeah. I mean, I think part of it honestly will be aided by two things. One is it's a popular deck in Modern, too, or at least it was at different points in time. So there are probably a lot of players who are maybe on the fence about Pioneer, or people who play a lot of Pioneer on Magic Online who are used to playing like, well, I'm just going to fire up Mono Green Devotion again, who maybe like to play creativity in Modern. That'll just be like, fine, I'll try a similar deck here as well. And then the other thing is just, the idea that it's just something new and more control combo-ish, which this is really the main control combo-ish deck that's available in Pioneer right now. And so, like we said, boomers like to play is it Splinter Twin. It's honestly why I tried to play Creativity and Modern a bunch, and why there's a chance I'll try this too. I will say, wow, did Creativity go up in price over the last few days? Finally, I've been waiting like 2 years for that card to price spike, and now it's $30 a pop. So look out if you don't have them.
Glad I got mine for $5, 6 months ago.
Exactly. Yeah. It's been waiting. Small set mythic. So let's move on to the next thing. So here's another thing that was interesting to me is that everything that we talked about, the poor performance of the top half of the meta, this kind of like this tier of challenger decks that did better than we thought they were going to. The funny thing is that the people who actually made it through from day 1 to day 2, the meta was basically exactly the same. Day 1 to day 2. And I don't think we should be surprised by that. Something I wanted to point out. So there was actually more Rakdos and Gruul than day 2 than there was in day 1. Both of those went up by a few percentage. Rakdos went up to 16%. Gruul Vehicles went up to 11%. Is It Creativity became the fourth highest represented deck, in day 2. It was tied for 4th with Azorius Control. Monogreen Devotion and Gruul were tied for 2nd and 3rd. So those all went up, interestingly, but it's kind of a funny quirk of how tournaments can work when you're eliminating people, because what happened is, even though we had these results that were kind of all over the place across the small sample size of day 1, it was kind of like everybody just fell away in a way that fit the statistics of the metagame without any real outliers.
Yeah, I mean, I think, a lot of these, when I'm trying to see exactly what went down, but kind of Rakdos went up a little bit. I think Mono White took a big dip, which makes sense given its, abysmal win rate, because it was 6.8%. And if you look at day 2, it was 4.41%. So a little bit of a dip there.
Yep.
But yeah, so with, looking at this particular metagame, a lot of it didn't change specifically in terms of like what decks and percentages too much, but like the one thing that did change is like, given the win rates, like, exactly their positioning in the total, like the percent of the day 2 meta, that's kind of what changed the most. But yeah, a lot of this is somewhat surprising, or not surprising. A lot of it's what we expected. But yeah, Gruul Vehicles being 3rd, got Rakdos Sack. But yeah, I think this is pretty much what we would expect.
Yeah, and the main reason I wanted to bring this point up was, one, because I took the time to do a pivot table of my own of the day 1 results, so I just wanted to put that out there for everybody. But also, it was just fascinating to me that it's not like the people who, if they had a bad Rakdos matchup, who snuck through day 1 without seeing Rakdos suddenly got a lot less likely to see Rakdos. Like, it was just the same tournament all the way through. So I don't think that the results reflect like a strange kind of metagame emerging at the top tables, with maybe a couple of exceptions that we'll talk about in the next bucket. So let's move on to the next bucket. So my next take was that some of the rogues really did actually break the format this time. Now, maybe it's true, maybe it's not, but I do think, Creativity aside, which is the deck that's kind of the headline of this tournament, there were clearly a couple other decks that were headlines as well that did not fall into the top half of the meta. So these were a few left field decks that a few brave pilots were willing to bring along that served them well. And I think the place we have to start with when we're talking about this is auras, and specifically Selesnya auras. So Benton Madsen was the last player to be undefeated. Started out day 1 8-0 and managed to get into the top 8 after round 15. So they had a 4-3 record in day 2 to close everything out. The meta breakdowns that I looked at, one of them had all the auras decks lumped together. But let's look at Frank Karsten's metagame breakdown. There were only 2 pilots on Selesnya auras, it looks like, and they went 12-7. There was an Orzhov auras deck that went 6-3, and an Abzan auras deck that went 18-12. So there were probably 3 or 4 players on that. All of those decks had at least a 60% win rate, with Selesnya auras, the deck that went the farthest, having a 63.2% win rate. I think it's a reasonable sample size with that many people playing it. What do we think happened with auras? How did auras manage to do well in this tournament?
It's all Skrell, baby. So the Abzan auras deck in particular, I think that was a team, because I on today's stream before we started recording, I played an Abzan Auras deck I found from Simon Nielsen, and I believe that might be that team deck list. It's a little bit different from Benton's, but specifically if we look at Benton's deck list, this was green white, so we got 4 Gladecover Scouts, 4 Skrelvs, which is a brand new card that we had some little bit of hype on in the preview show. Specifically, the thing that I like about this deck is it has, I guess not the full 8 copies, but 4 Ethereal Armor, 3 All That Glitters. It's really just kind of, I've seen the list that I played today only had 1 All That Glitters as kind of like a tutor target for Light Paws. And I think this is a really good approach, especially with Skrelv, because like normally before Skrelv, you kind of had to shove, you kind of either had to mulligan to Gladecover Scout every time, or you had to just like, cast your 2-drop on turn 2 and just cross your fingers. But now, even in the hands that don't have Scout, you can just go turn 1 Skrelv, turn 2 2-drop, and you have the protection backup already. And as soon as you get to untap with Light Paws or SRAM, the fireworks begin. So I like Benton's deck list a lot. I think it's very well built for the metagame. As far as the Auras deck's place in the metagame, it's just an incredibly fast and incredibly hard to hate out deck. There's not a lot of cards that people are playing outside of Extinction Event, which is a card that you have to worry about out of Rakdos. And
Filigree Silex, I think, is the other card that also your Ratchet Bomb effect is something that has some play against this card, but
yeah, at least against Filigree Silex, like if they play card on turn 3 and they get Silex, it's kind of face up, and you can maybe kill them before that. But like with Rakdos, if they're Thoughtseizing you might not have enough stuff to be able to kill them before they can get to Extinction Event, and it's not face up because they don't like play the card and then down tick. So. But yeah, I think it's in a really good spot, has an incredibly good mono green matchup, very good mono white matchup. And I think if you just look at the deck across the board in terms of the top 5 decks, just really good matchups there. And it's always just nice to, play a deck that has this linear of a game plan, especially when there's not like Liliana the Veils or Shieldred's Edict. There's not a ton of those cards floating around, so I think it's a pretty good metagame call, and I love the list a lot.
Yeah. I mean, I mentioned last week that I really like to play Auras in Pioneer. I've played black-white Auras. I've played back when I really enjoyed Historic. Blue-white Auras was my deck of choice in that format, but of course that had access to much crazier cards than this one does.
Luris.
Yeah, well, Luris, and also I'm suddenly forgetting the name of the card from Zendikar or Rise of the Eldrazi, the Enchantress that draws cards and gets +2/+2.
Oh, Spirit Dancer.
Yeah, of course, Spirit Dancer. Exactly. Yeah, that card is absurd. But I do think that this is a deck that has a strong core. It was pretty good in the RCs in the fall. At least I remember at DreamHack, it got a little bit of heat to it. I think some of the other regional ones also had people playing it. I will say, not to be a little bit of a downer, if you look at the matchup breakdowns, according to Frank Karsten, the Orzhov Auras deck never faced Rakdos. The Selesnya Auras deck only faced Rakdos 1 time in the Swiss and won. And then the Abzan Auras deck, the team faced Rakdos 3 times and did not win a match with it. So this is maybe another one of those decks where okay, you're trading a lot of percentage, so if you look at the number of matches that they played between you're talking about how you should play Rakdos maybe once every 6 or 7 matches. This is clearly below that rate by probably, 4 matches, let's say. Maybe they should have played it twice as many times as they did. So that might have put a little bit of a dent in it, but I do think this deck still has a chance to be really good. Theoretically, Skrelv should be reasonably good in that matchup against Rakdos. So we might not really have a clear picture of what happens to this deck versus Rakdos after Skrelv exists, because there's just not as much of a sample size here right now.
One thing about the Abzan Auras deck is, if this is the same list that I played, this is no Gladecover Scout, which is probably part of the reason why you see it went 0-3 against Rakdos. But if you look at the rest of the matchups, 6-0 against Mono Green, 3-0 against Gruul, 5-0 against Lotus Field, only 1-0 against Mono White. But yeah, just like that specific combination is, I think that's kind of what they decided, is that they were like, well, we don't want to have to mulligan to Gladecover Scout. We just won't play it. We'll punt our Rakdos matchup. We'll beat everything else. And that's what they did.
Yep.
So.
Yeah. And that's exactly the next thing I was going to say, actually. And this is the deck that Aaron was talking about when he was trying to explain to people, it's okay to play a deck that loses to Rakdos, even if it feels bad, because look at these numbers against everything else. So the other thing I like about Auras, honestly, too, is that it is a budget-ish friendly deck, depending on how you manage to get a hold of mana confluences. So I think that that's a nice thing as well. You know what I mean? Like, so I'm glad to see a deck that's a little bit on the cheaper end do well at Pro Tours like this. And, you know, always hated Boggles in Modern, but for some reason in this like mid-sized Eternal format, I've enjoyed playing the Auras decks as they've come and gone. So
it's okay when there's only 4 Boggles.
Yes, I think that's true. That's true, right? So you think this deck will be around for a little bit, right?
It's tough because it's one of those things where very similar in Modern to like, you know, Dredge and these kinds of things. It's one of those, if the deck picks up a lot in popularity, there are plenty of good sideboard cards that you can play. Mm-hmm. So we'll have to see, you know, if it picks up enough to where it's, you know, maybe 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th most played deck, more sideboard cards get added, like Back to Nature. I don't know if you played against that card before, but it is impossible to beat.
Yeah, so. You're just done. That's why you need a Spell Pierce in your deck. And then you're just doing a whole different thing, you know? All right. So the next deck on this list, and this is a deck that we kind of dragged a little bit last week. It's Greasefang. Okay. This was the wildest thing to me, is that Greasefang was actually the most winning deck in the tournament with a 67.6% win rates. Here's the funniest thing about it. So Frank was nice enough to include confidence intervals in all of his notes here. So Greasefang went 23-11, and Greasefang is the only deck where its entire confidence interval is above 50%. So even accounting for variance, according to math, which, you know, Frank Carson is good at, I hear, it should have been a positive deck the whole way. And this deck just ripped up the top 3 decks of the meta. It went 8-1 against Rakdos, 5-1 against Mono Green Devotion, and 2-0 against Gruul Vehicles. A little bit worse against some of the other decks, and clearly it didn't capture all of the matchups they had. But what happened with Greasefang?
So I think maybe we kind of underestimated it a little bit. You know, we talked about how it was a very, maybe more of a high variance deck. One thing I will note here, and there's some really interesting, I guess, tech, but it's more so the absence of Satyr Wayfinder. So I'm looking at David Inglis's deck right now, and we have no Satyr Wayfinder, and I believe 3 Vessel of Nascency. Yeah. Now, one of the more played comb and hate cards is like the Sorcery Speed Graveyard Hate stuff, like Unlicensed Hearse, Graveyard Trespasser, stuff like that. And the issue with Satyr Wayfinder is you're dumping the Barhelion on your main phase. So if your opponent has one of those pieces of Graveyard Hate, you're effectively getting 2 for 1. So by playing with Vessel, you can go turn 1 Vessel. If your opponent has, you know, a Hearse or something, you just don't activate the Vessel, use a removal spell on the Hearse or what have you. And you're not exposing your stuff to the main phase Graveyard Hate, which I like a lot. I think this list is incredible. Yeah. Very, very well thought out. Very, you know, you're not losing a lot of consistency because you still have the Graveyard Enabler. You're just swapping it around and you're doing it at instant speed and loading up on like Salvage and Vessel. So I think the list is really well thought out. I think it's a really good list. And, their whole team did pretty well. That definitely crushed the tournament. So
yeah, I got to say a couple other notes that I noticed in David's list as well, for what it's worth, because this to me felt like a totally new take on the Greasefang core in Pioneer. So you talked about Vessel of Nascency. I think David's list had 4 Witherbloom commands in it main, which I haven't seen in a lot of the other decks, especially as a 4 of. You know, Witherbloom command, I feel like is a card that's like right outside of playable. As far as those commands go from Strixhaven, it's like, you know, Prismari command is clearly the playable one. And then all the rest of them are kind of bad because they're expensive or sorcery speed, but Witherbloom command at least is 2 mana and sorcery speed, and you can do self-mill. It's got some creature interaction as part of it. It does a bunch of different things. This deck also had 3 Traverse the Ulenwald, which I thought was an interesting choice to be able to play up this idea of being a Delirium deck and trying to take advantage of the graveyard as much as you can. Using Traverse instead of like Eldritch Evolution is something that lets you. I don't think there's any place where you're not using Traverse to get Greasefang in this deck, because the only other two creatures in this deck are Scrapwork Mutt and Rafine's Informant. I don't know when you're going to go get one of those cards. Maybe. What do you think?
Probably
I don't think
not.
so.
The nice thing about kind of going back on what piggybacking on what you're saying. I can't talk today.
That's right.
The nice
You
thing
had a long
about
weekend,
not
long
playing
drive.
that is true. The really nice thing about like Eldritch Evolution is kind of like a package deal. So you played alongside Stitcher Supplier and Seder Wayfinder. And as we already talked about Seder Wayfinder, it's putting your stuff in your graveyard in your main phase, which you don't want to do. And Supplier is another, another reason of that. And I think that that is something that they considered when constructing this deck list, because you see the absence of both Evolution, Wayfinder, and Supplier, and you see Max Command, which is probably a nod to Mono Green, because blowing up your Llanowar Elf and your Wolfwillow Haven, good luck winning that game. And also a nod to blue-white control, because Evolution is one of your worst cards against blue-white control, because you have to sacrifice a creature, get 2 for 1. So I think this list is incredibly metagamed, incredibly well-built, and also sideboard forward Liliana the Veils. They definitely were prepared for blue-white.
Yeah. It's fascinating to see, after being like, this deck is just full RNG, to see someone come along and go, no, this core is actually really good. Let me show you how to turn it into something that is a little grindier, a little more thought out. I thought was really cool. And then the last deck I had in this kind of rogues area is Omnath to Light. So players went 19-2 with this deck with a 61.3% win percentage. And this deck, we haven't talked about this kind of 4-color control kind of deck, or 4-color mid-range, depending on how you want to think about it. But the idea behind this is basically it's your Bring to Light package, just like you see in Modern, just like you used to see some of in the Niv list. But this doesn't have to play all those awkward gold cards that Niv has to play. It just gets to play your Valky. It gets to play your you get to play Slaughter Game still. You get to play, I don't have the list right in front of me, you get to play your One Wrath, like that kind of thing. I just thought this was an interesting take to just go, maybe Omnath is just good enough as a target for this. Surprise that Omnath could be good enough, of course. But you don't have to do the Niv to Light stuff anymore and go all the way up there. You just go for Omnath. And I thought it was really interesting.
Yeah, it's funny you put this in the notes, because I actually played this deck on stream today.
Oh, nice.
And played a couple leagues with it. Initially, I thought that, like you had mentioned cutting Niv Mizzet, and the reason a lot of people on stream were asking me, why would you cut Niv Mizzet? And the deck was playing 4 Chain of the Rocks and 4 Leyline Binding as its removal spells. Right. And a lot of the Niv list before had to play a mix of Dreadbore, Abrupt Decay, Vanishing Verse, all this kind of stuff, all these situational gold cards. Yeah. And you just get to play the cleanest removal spells. Yeah. You still have a lot of the good Bring to Light targets. You have Valky, you have the Selfless Glyph Weaver, Extinction Event, Slaughter Games, but you just get to play, better removal. You don't have to play all these crappy gold cards. And I actually felt like the list was really good, and I'm not surprised to see that their win rate was exceptional in this Pro Tour.
Yeah. Coolest card in this list, I have to say, though, was Courier's Briefcase. Oh, yeah. It had a Courier's Briefcase in it. You get a token, you get a treasure token, essentially. You get a citizen token. I don't know why you want a 1/1, but also later you can play Wooburg to draw 3 off of it if you want to as well, which is a pretty interesting just card that, I don't know. I don't think, in my mind, I would never give that card a second look, and somehow someone was like, you know what, this does some stuff for us. It lets us cast Bring to Light a turn earlier if we want to, and then also late game, it's not the worst thing in the world.
Out of 2 leagues, how many times do you think I sacrificed Courier's Briefcase?
For mana or to draw 3?
No, draw 3.
Once.
4 times.
4 times. Wow.
It really comes up. Yeah, it really comes up. I mean, you trade a lot of 1-for-1, and it's basically like Sylvan Carrier did 5 and 6 with just a ton of upside.
Right. I was going to say this is basically Niv Mizzet, right? Because it's Wooburg draw 3. Yeah. Right. Yeah. So there you go.
Mulldrifter.
I mean, we haven't had a real Omnath deck in Pioneer for a minute, I feel like. So it's interesting to see people kind of find a home for a card that's clearly powerful. I mean, it's powerful enough that people talk about wanting it banned in Modern sometimes. So a lot of times, I'm not surprised to see these strategies that the key cards are in Pioneer, try to get them ported down into Modern when it's possible, like creativity as well.
I think a lot of people just assume that all math is banned in Pioneer.
Really? Yeah, that's probably true. I mean, I assumed that someone told me Tybalt's Trickery. Someone said, oh yeah, well, Tybalt's Trickery can kill people on turn 2 in Pioneer. I was like, that card's not banned in Pioneer? Guess not. All right, all you Tybalt's Trickery stands, come back to Pioneer.
Dave, I'm secretly
Shane?
here.
You're not even on this app.
No, I'm not. But I thought that I would crash the ad break because, astute listeners have likely noticed that we have not had the patented Barrister and Man ad drop. So what we've been doing is just sort of waiting for some new stuff to come in from our buddy Will over at Barrister and Man, and we got some really interesting things recently that I thought we should talk about and tell our devoted Barrister and Man fans out there all about.
We're going to talk about colognes for the first time, I think with some
you're
depth.
right.
Is that right?
I think we should, because I now have 2 different Barrister and Man fragrances. And so when I got these from Will, I honestly have never had anything quite like them, because much like everything else Barrister and Man does, these are novel, they are pretty intense, and they are a statement piece that really speaks to, I think, Will's love of fragrance, his devotion to the art, and the devotion to making novel products.
Yeah. But let's talk about cologne for a second. It's okay to wear cologne, right?
It's weird that I used to, until like my 20s, I thought it was like kind of weird. I was like, oh man, I don't have the confidence to pull this off. But I think that as I've gotten older and I've become sort of more confident and just like, want to make a little bit of a statement, want to smell like something, and I think I'm really into it. Like I like cologne. I wear cologne every day. Not a lot.
There you go.
Not too much.
So let's talk about the ones that you've been trying out then. What do you have?
Okay. So on my left wrist right now is Romance in Middlesex County, Eau de Parfum. Okay. And I have to say that the description of this scent, I'm sure it's leading me, but it's right on the money, right? It's like tangerine. It's like coffee. It's like jasmine. It's sandalwoody, like everything, but man, it's honestly like nothing I've ever had before. The coffee is really interesting and the cardamom is really interesting, but then it has like this huge like citrus balance to it that I think is really cool, and I'm into it. Like I only have like a small sample vial, but I could definitely use more of this because it's kind of a special occasion type thing. But I think because it's not quite as easy wearing as like an everyday thing, but it's definitely like a going out at night, going on a date type thing, and I think it's really cool.
Yeah.
What do you have?
Only available in sample vials right now, Romance of Middlesex County. So keep it in mind, $8.99 if you just want to get a tester from Will. Yeah. And while you're there, you can also check out what I have.
Yeah, what do you got?
So I have a couple. One I have is called Fougère Gothique.
Dave, I have that.
This is kind of a one that if you want to make more of a definitive statement, you would consider this one. It's a bit smoky.
Okay. I'm gonna hit myself with it right now.
Okay. Yeah, you tell me what you think about it.
Okay. No, you tell me, and then I'll agree or disagree.
Yeah. So this one for me really has this kind of musky, smoky scent.
Oh yeah. No, this is cool. It's like, yeah, I get the ash that you're talking about, but then it has like this huge like lavender, like leatheriness to it. I think is really cool.
Yeah. So that's if you want to make a big statement, you check out Fougère Gothique. And then I also have this other one that Will sent me that is called Just Right for a Tuesday.
I think Stan likes this one.
Yes. And this one is just right for a Tuesday. I love the concept that Will had behind it. It's just kind of like a light kind of scent that you can wear, fragrance that you can wear that's not too much. You can wear it to the office. You can have a fragrance perspective without making a fragrance announcement, let's say.
And you have to have those. You have to have kind of your everyday ones. You have to have kind of your statement ones for a special occasion. And if you are interested in checking out the fragrances over at Barrister and Man. They have the cologne selection, including the classic Seville eau de toilette, which is their one of their foundational smells. I have that eau de toilette. That's awesome. That's in my regular rotation. There's a Maryland, which is one of the new releases. I have the shaving soap of that, which is awesome. I'll talk more about that in coming weeks. So head on over to Barrister and Man, MANN. Use coupon code TheDiveDown2023 for 15% off your first order there. And we'll know that you came through us and smell just right for a Tuesday.
And then that leads us to our next take, which is basically there's actually even more decks that did better than the format standard bearers they didn't really feel broken, but there's two metagame calls that just did fine. And those are Enigmatic Fires, which is a deck that you had said you thought had some potential to top 8, and guess what? It did top 8, and it topped forward, just like you mentioned last week. And then Selesnya Angels is the other one. Enigmatic Fires had a 52% win rates. Seems like it could have fared better in a field with so much Rakdos, but it is what it is. They didn't draw the matchups maybe as much. And then Selesnya Angels went 54% win rates. Masahide Moriyama was 1 win away with the deck and finished in 7th place. The thing I don't really want to point out, but I would just mention about this is that Moriyama went 9-1 in constructed with Angels and had an 0-3 draft on day 2. And that probably is the thing that prevented them from making the top 8, unfortunately.
That's tough.
Yeah, that's really tough. Okay, so there's a lot of decks, right? These we talked about the tier 2 of the meta. Now we're talking about all these other decks that kind of popped up. Do we think that any of these broke it? Do you think that when we said last week, yeah, there's a chance someone could break it? These aren't new decks that broke it, but they are different. They're from metagamed from cards that we already had access to. What do you think about this tier?
I think if I had to look at all of the decks in this tier and I was forced to pick one that I think would have necessarily defined as broke it, I think probably the Greasefang deck, which is not something I thought I was going to say last week. We had, I know we had talked about it. We had kind of maligned it a little bit, but the innovations that team made were just incredible. I think that they're very, very smart in terms of what they were preparing for. One thing I will note about the Enigmatic Fires too, Derek Davis has been on an absolute tear as of late. Derek Davis was Mox championship competitor, Nerd Rage championship competitor, won the Showcase Challenge with Enigmatic Incarnation, which we talked about last week, and then following it up with another insane performance here. So I believe he's just done it all the way with Incarnation. So very, very, very very good player. I watched him play in top 8 too, and he just played phenomenally.
Yeah.
So not
also
surprised
got
to see him do well.
Yeah, and got the Rakdos matchup in top 8 as well to get into the top 4, right? He played against Shota, right?
Oh, he beat the crap out of Shota. It was brutal.
I mean, like you said, he also played against Rakdos 3 times in the Swiss and went 3-0. So the deck is clearly a Rakdos killer for sure. All right.
Yeah, I want to look at Frank's thing real quick.
Sure.
Let's see. Where is Enigmatic Fires 12 and 11? Enigmatic Fires. Yeah, 6-0 against Rakdos.
Yep.
So
6-0 against Rakdos, 0-3 against Mono Green, 0-2 against Vehicles, 0-1 against Lotus Field, 1-0 against Mono White Humans, and then it kind of goes from there. All right. Well, that's kind of like a lot of stuff on the meta. Hopefully kind of organizing it there by just headlines, I think gives people kind of a story as we go through it. But I do have some more kind of like last couple things before we get out of the tournament. The 7th thing I had on my mind after thinking about this tournament for a while, writing about it was, and tell me what you think about this, Fable the Mirror Breaker is just the best card in the format. Here's what I'm going to, here's my case. Oh, you agree right off the top. All right. So here's the case for this though, for people who are curious. In Frank's preview article, when he showed the meta that was registered for the tournament, the most played non-land cards across all main decks were Fable, Thoughtseize, Fatal Push, Llanowar Elves, Elvish Mystic, and Bonecrusher Giant. It's interesting to see this is the class of Pioneer. These are cards that we talked about last week. These are things that we recognize as the best ramp spell, great removal, or two great 2-for-1s, excellent hand disruption, most efficient removal spell. The decks that really relied on these cards, though, had the worst rates, with one exception, and that's Fable. And then Fable also turned out to be in Creativity. It was in Omnath to Light. It was in Enigmatic Fires. Of course, it was in Rakdos Mid and Rakdos Sack. Rakdos Mid didn't do great. Rakdos Sack did do well. I think it's just the best card in the format. Why do you think that is? How do you think we got to a point where this 3-mana enchantment that nobody paid attention to at spoiler season turned out to be the best card in this format? And honestly, good enough for slow deck Modern play. There's not a ton of decks in Modern that can play it, but it comes up enough. It comes up in Creativity and Modern, for example.
Yeah, I mean, going back on Modern just real quickly, Creativity wasn't, as far as I remember, it really wasn't that much of a thing before Fable. I know people had tried it, but it was kind of on the fringes up until when Fable was printed, and that was really just a massive printing. But the reason I think the card is so, it just offers so many decks, so many different things. So in Rakdos, when you're playing Rakdos, you have a lot of situational removal spells, discard spells that aren't quite as good past, a certain point if your opponent has run out of cards, and Fable allowing you to filter otherwise dead draws. Even if you look at the Creativity deck, a lot of situational removal spells, you have Worldspine Worm and Xenagos, which most of the times, you could still cast Xenagos, but Worldspine Worm does nothing in your hand. So it's, be able to get that one out of there. So it offers you the card, discard 2, draw 2 is almost worth a card, maybe a card and a half most of the time. You get the 2/2, which is worth a card. If the 2/2 lives, you get another card. And then if at the end of the day, you still get another card. So, I mean, it's realistically, it's like a 5-for-1 if it's, unless they count it on the stack. So it's, even though it's slow, Pioneer is a format where it's not as fast as Modern. So you have a lot more time to develop Fable and get the full value out of all the chapters. And the other thing is, we're seeing it a lot. A lot of the Fable decks, some of them even paired alongside Elves to get it, get it into play a turn faster. Yeah. But yeah, I 100% agree with you. I think Fable is just, by far head and shoulders the best card in the format. And yeah, definitely.
Is this card in trouble? In a format where we banned expressive iteration,
it's true.
This isn't that far off, right?
I guess that is a good point. Expressive iteration did get banned. We'll see what happens. It was it the actual most played card? Let me see if I can find the numbers here. So we look at the most played cards. It was Blackcleave Cliffs at 129, Copperline 81, whatever. We don't count the lands. Skrelv at 44, Migloss 38.
This is just the new cards, I think. The list you're looking at.
Oh, that's the new cards. Yeah. Oh, it is. I don't know if they have the actual list of the total cards, but
we'll see if we can.
Yeah. In any case, we'll see if we can find that. Yep. But yeah, I don't know. I could definitely see a world if you told me tomorrow, if I woke up tomorrow and you told me that Fable was no longer in the format, I don't know if I'd be 100% surprised because of how powerful it is and how much card advantage it provides. But now that Pioneer is kind of maybe on the backseat for another whatever until the next Pioneer Pro Tour is for the most part. I'd like to see maybe some other shakeups happen. I could see some unbans or, maybe some other things that could happen.
Yeah.
But,
yeah.
At the end of the day, I wouldn't be surprised in the long run if it didn't.
Yeah. I'm definitely not asking you to say if it should be banned or not, because that's when we get the emails is when we claim. Okay. I'm just feeling, I'm starting to feel like it's like a DEFCON 3 here, where you're kind of I'd be keeping an eye on it, just given the past. All right. So next thing. So we add up all this stuff together, and I was thinking about this really, and we kind of touched on this a little bit, but a lot of people are asking, what are our expectations of the meta shifting based on the top 8 in this tournament today? Here's what I think. I think that the meta at your LGS likely won't change long term because of the results of this Pro Tour, with the exception of maybe 1 or 2 decks. But I don't think suddenly people are going to stop taking Rakdos tournaments, or it's going to stop taking mono green devotion to tournaments at your store, at the places, or even at RCQs, or even the RCs at Pioneer as they come up. And what do you have in your hands there?
These are the Heraldo Unites the Elves, the Moritz.
Your Moritz. Oh,
That's
gosh.
my LGS.
Were you surprised that deck didn't come up at all?
No, not at all. I knew that
Not
deck
at all.
was bad.
That's funny. Yeah, I mean, our listener Kiefer asks, what kind of expectations do we have on the metagame shifting based on the top 8? What sideboard cards do we be looking at to combat them? Do we need to prepare for new decks when thinking about Pioneer? I think my answer is probably not really, but what do you think?
Yeah, for the most part, I think that what you see at your LGS is going to be what you see moving forward, with the exception of maybe Boggles, because as you said, that deck is fairly cheap to assemble, and maybe if you have somewhat of a modern collection already and you already have the Mana Confluences and maybe you have the Temple Gardens, there's really not that much else in the deck.
Right.
So maybe see an uptick in Boggles because the deck is so cheap. But yeah, for the most part, the rest of there are some cards in Pioneer that are fairly expensive. So with that in particular, you have to keep that in mind with LGSs. People don't want to always go out and buy a bunch of brand new cards just to go and play FNM. So I think for the most part, it'll stay the same with maybe a small uptick in Boggles.
Yeah. How about creativity? You think there could be an uptick in creativity too?
That card's so expensive.
Yeah, I mean, creativity is, and also, World Spine Worm isn't the easiest thing to get a hold of. Xenagod might be hard to get a hold of these days too. But all right, but here's what I do think. So I think the ninth and basically final thought that I had about the tournament that I want to run by Devon as we get out of this part is I think the Pioneer meta at your store will still change a lot because Phyrexia All Will Be One did not really make a splash in this tournament almost at all. So outside of the lands, there wasn't really that much stuff that showed up. So as we were talking about a minute ago, the lands were pretty high, and then the number one played card was Skrelv with 44 copies, then Miglaws with 38 copies, then Thrun with 15 copies, then Luca Bound to Ruin with 15 copies. And as you said, that's a card that's a little bit sideboard-ish, right? Like it's not, in this case, it had 11 in the sideboard and 4 in main decks. Filigree Silex, and then you're kind of into the swords, Ossification, and then Elish Norn, which is a one-of in a lot of decks, but that still only had 10 copies, so I still feel like there's a ton of stuff out here that's missing, right? And is this the area where maybe you were expecting to see more decks based on this?
One thing I will say here, which makes me very, very sad, 0 copies of Typhon.
I know. Me too.
I had such high hopes.
Yeah, that also means 0 copies of Vannifar, Devon, which means no tattoo.
I know. That's true. I guess that's good news for you.
It is. Yeah, I don't have the money or the time for a full back piece right now, but
there's always time, right?
Yeah.
Down the road. But yeah, these a lot of these results, if you look at Thrun, for example, so you get, 44 Skrelv, 38 Miglaws. So Skrelv was pretty much, I think some of the mono white decks had it, a lot of the Auras decks had it. And then you have Miglaws, all 38 copies, all in the main deck. And then after 44 and 38, the next one down is Thrun at 15, but they were all sideboard.
Yeah.
So there wasn't even any, I'm pretty sure these were all just like mono green sideboards, if I recall correctly, or maybe a couple in Gruul.
Yeah.
But yeah, not a ton here from the new set, which was a little surprising. I'm very surprised that at least nobody pulled the trigger on Hammer. I felt like maybe there just wasn't enough time before the Pro Tour. Maybe people weren't kind of convinced on it, and they were maybe kind of settling where I was, where it was maybe the deck needs a little bit more of a robust backup plan. Like the combo itself is really powerful, Scam plus Hammer plus Sigardus Aid, but you need to find a better plan B. And then again, as we said, no copies of Tyvar. Very sad to see that. No elves, no Vannifar, none of that kind of stuff.
I was surprised to see that there weren't any copies of Atraxa, like especially with creativity becoming a big thing. I kind of thought maybe that card would rate as a sideboard option, especially, but I guess that maybe Channel Fireball either didn't have the time to test it out or just felt like it wasn't really a fit for the metagame as it was.
The thing about Atraxa is the reason that creativity gets a lot of percentage points in so many matchups is the fact that it has the ability to just kind of kill you on turn 5. Whereas if you put Atrax in your deck, you're not necessarily, you don't have that closing speed that the World Spine Worm Xenagos offers you. I tried a bunch of different, I will say there were 4 copies in the tournament, but if I remember correctly, I think they were all in Lotus Field sideboards. I think it was Joel Lassette's team. They all played 1 copy. So that is, something there. But I was more of a big fan of it in the Transmogrify deck, because that's where you want to just, Transmogrify is effectively a polymorph. But the nice thing about it is you get to play artifacts. So you actually get to play Courier's Briefcase, which allows you to do it a turn early. And you're not trying to do creativity X equals 2, because you're just putting 1 Atrax into play. But that might have stared some of the creativity players away from. Sword of Forge and Frontier at 13 copies, but 10 of them were in the sideboard, that was kind of my take as well. What I'm a little more surprised is the 15 copies of Luca, only 4 in the main deck. I was fairly high on that card in terms of, its main deck potential in boats. So a little surprised to only see 4 in the main deck out of the 15. And then the rest of this list, we got Zealot's Conviction. I don't even know what that card does. I'm not looking it up. And then Prophetic Prism, which is a fake new card, because I think it was already legal in Pioneer. So that's kind of cheating. But yeah, overall, I think there's definitely more room to brew, and I'm going to keep brewing.
Yeah.
So
I mean, and that's where I think it's going to happen here, especially, we've got 6 weeks or so, whatever, until March of the Machine comes out, and there's just a lot of stuff to still check out and see if we can get a Tyvar deck to work, if we can get a Kemba deck to work. Mind Splice Apparatus, there was one person who brought that deck. It seems like there's a lot going on there to figure out. So, Mickey, one of our listeners, asked, what card or cards from one were you most surprised to not see represented? All of them, I would say, except for Skrelv and Migloss. Those turned out to be the 2 clear ones that made sense.
yeah, Tyvar would be my number 1 surprise to not see anybody.
That's
play.
my honest answer too. My real answer, my non-hyperbolic answer. All right, the last thing was this was a great top 8, right? This is like an unbelievable top 8.
Pretty good.
This list of names: Gabe Nassif, Reed Duke, Shota Yasaoka, Nathan Stoyer. Okay, that's 4. That's 3 Hall of Famers and the reigning world champ. And then Derek Davis, who you talked about, who is on a tear right now, I think he was in a Mox recently and also was in the Energy Championship Series final as well. Not the final, but I think he made it all the way to the top 8. And then there were good RC qualifiers from Chris Ferber, Benton Madsen, who had a great run, and then Takumi Matsura on Mono White. And so it was a pretty good mix of all-time world beaters and some newcomers. And then the wildest thing to me about this, honestly, was the fact that the finals were Reed versus Benton. And that was the same matchup as the first match that was broadcast and constructed on Friday. And Reed lost that one. He lost round 4 or whatever, and then came back and won it in the rematch in the finals. But our top 4 predictions were not very great. So mine was Rakdos times 2, Blue-White Control, and Mono Blue Spirit. So I had one of the decks I said made it in the top 8, and that was it. Shane said Rakdos, which made it in the top 8, Lotus, 2 in the top 8, none in the top 4. So he actually did an okay job with getting the top 8 decks. 1 Blue-White Control. He and I were too high on Blue-White Control, I guess. And then 1 Rogue, he said, and included Enigmatic in the couple of decks that he listed there. So we got to give him a check mark for that.
Do we? He's not here.
He's not here. That's true. Maybe not. And then you said 1 Rakdos Mid, 1 Enigmatic Fires, which if I had a bell, I would ring it, 1 Gruul Vehicles, and 1 Vanifar. I'm not going to give you too much guff about Vanifar right now, but
No.
Nah. But yeah, I mean, I know that we pulled those names out of a hat, but actually, we kind of got around it. I think that none of us really saw Channel Fireball picking up creativity is what happened. And none of us took our Mono White too serious. So that's kind of where it was at.
Yeah, I think my one thing that my initial read on the situation was that I thought that people thought more people would play Blue-White Control. And I thought, at least if I was playing in the Pro Tour in my expected metagame, I probably would have had Blue-White Control 3rd or 4th. I don't know why, but it's just, control players, PT players love playing control. So the blue-white matchup is really sketchy for the creativity deck, which is why, when we talked about our metagame predictions last week, I didn't really write it off per se, but I didn't expect it to do well because I expected people to prepare for blue-white control, and if they're preparing for blue-white control, then they don't want to play creativity. But maybe they had a different read on the metagame, and they definitely got it right.
But what happens if the players that were going to play blue-white control are the same players that decide to play creativity? Because that kind of could have been what happened, right? We saw that Gabe Nassif was testing out Dimir control last week, and I forget the other player that was on his team that we were talking. Oh, it was Wafo was also testing out Dimir control last week. Maybe they played around with control for a while and decided, guess what? This is bad. We need to switch to something else. So it's almost as if they almost like picked their own meta because they could have been the people that led to blue-white being overrepresented.
True. That's a good point. I like that.
But anyway, it's a great tournament. And thanks for going through that with me. It was fun to just kind of catch up and see what we all thought about it. I think Pioneer is fun. Like I said, we're going to lessen our focus on the format here on the show coming up soon. But, I think it's a good balanced format. I know you devote plenty of time to it as well. What's your one last thought about Pioneer before we kind of close this segment and talk about a couple of spoiler cards?
People are not playing enough copies of Lovestruck Beast in their Boats deck. I've seen a lot of lists like trimming going to 2 and 3, and I tried that a little bit as well. But play 4 of that card. It's really good.
There you go.
It's a 2-for-1.
All right. Well, we're going to take a little break, and then we'll come right back and talk quickly in a wind down section about the random March of the Machine cards that we got. Stay with us. Okay, so believe it or not, after all that talk we had about the Pro Tour, we have some cards to talk about, some new cards to talk about from the set that's not even going to be out until April. And that set, March of the Machines, honestly, it looks like Avengers Endgame. I know it's supposed to look like Avengers Endgame. That's what it is. It's the universe coming together to fight Elish Norn. But, I thought it would be fun for a little quick segment after all the Pro Tour talk to just kind of talk about some of the cards that were interesting here. There's weird flavor stuff. We won't get into it. Phyrexia is messing up everything. We're going to get greatest hits of all the planes. They're blowing up all the planes. It's what they like to do in Magic. We know how it is. But there were 3 cards that stood out to me that I thought would be cool to talk about. Devon, glad to hear any cards that you thought were interesting that you would want to add to the list as well. But the first one for me was actually an invitational card, which we haven't seen for a minute. And that is Yuta Takahashi's World Champ card. And that is Fairy Mastermind. It's a generic and a blue for a fairy rogue. It's a 2/1 flash flying. Whenever an opponent draws their second card each turn, you draw a card, and it has the activated ability of 3 generic and a blue. Each player draws a card. This card is sweet. I don't know where this card goes, but this card is great.
I love it. Yeah. Like, can you imagine somebody casting a cantrip and you just respond and flash this guy in?
Yeah.
It just seems
exactly.
so good.
I mean, that's what it's supposed to be, too. So I've heard that he kind of designed it for potential legacy play, essentially, to kind of punish people for playing Brainstorm, which, let's punish people for playing Brainstorm. I'm fine with that. But I would love to see this card potentially end up in like Rogues and Pioneer, as a card that's good against Phoenix or something like that. Or even someplace in Modern, although Modern has its complications with card draw right now because it still has expressive iteration.
Yeah. And this doesn't trigger off expressive iteration, which is kind of awkward. And it's like, a lot of people play Teferi Time Raveler, but if they, minus Teferi, well, if they play Teferi and you respond with this, they just uptick, they don't bounce, or they just bounce your 2/1 and then you can't recast it again. So it's kind of awkward against Teferi.
Right. It's super awkward because you suddenly can't cast it as Flash anymore. Yeah. That's too bad. I don't know. What do you think about this deck in like Pioneer or one of the lower powered formats?
It is a rogue, which is, as you said, very important creature typing. So I could definitely see it in like the rogue shell because that deck is really trying to play on its opponent's turn with all the flash rogues and stuff like that. So I could see it as like, a 1 or 2 of it. It is, 2 mana, 2/1 flash flying is just good stats, especially when you're trying to like play that tempo style game, but kind of beat down, kind of not beat down. So I could see it definitely being a card you maybe want to play in Rogues, or maybe as even like a sideboard option in like a control mirror breaker kind of thing. It's also like kind of weirdly powerful with Narset, where it's like Narset shuts off your opponent from drawing extra cards, but if you have this in play with Narset, then they don't draw extra cards off the ability. It's just 4 mana draw cards, so keep that in mind as well.
Oh, yeah, that's interesting. I forgot about that part too. Yeah, this card is a well-designed, interesting card, though, I think, for sure. And of course, I think it's hard to find a Magic player who doesn't have a soft spot for, generic blue 2/1s with flash, RIP. All right, next card on the list, Thalia and the Gitrog monster. Okay, these are weird.
Excuse me?
Yeah, exactly. There's a whole cycle of cards in this set that are like, let's take two iconic creatures from legends, really, two iconic legendary creatures from a plane and put them on a card together. So this is Thalia literally riding on the giant frog that is the Gitrog monster. So the type line says legendary creature, human frog horror. Still not as good as Vanifar's type line of elf ooze wizard. But so this card costs generic white, black, green. First strike, death touch. You may play an additional land on each of your turns. Creatures and non-basic lands your opponents control enter the battlefield tapped. Whenever Thalia and the Gitrog monster attacks, sacrifice a creature or land, then draw a card. It's a 4/4. So this is literally the abilities of Thalia Heretic Cathar stapled together with Gitrog, right?
This is hilarious. Oh my goodness. This spoiler season is going to be really fun.
It's going to be totally absurd. But this card, here's one thing. I look at this card and I'm like, how was I ever happy casting Urnum Jin? Like,
I know, right?
That's what I used to do. I loved it. I loved it. I was like, I have Urnum Jin and I will win because I have Swords to Plowshares as well. And that's my whole deck. But so this is a 4/4 that draws a card, lets you play as an extra land, and cannot lose in combat. I mean, it's
pretty good.
How many creatures do you have to put in front of this thing to kill it?
At least 2, most likely.
Yeah, exactly.
I kind of like it though. Oh, first strike and death touch. I missed the death touch part. Okay, never mind. Yeah, that's you're not blocking this thing.
Right, never blocking this. Unless you have another first striker, which is not going to... You have your own Thalia and the Gitrog monster, and then maybe you're cool with trading, I guess.
I like it though. It's got good stats. White, black, green for Pioneer is a little sketchy. Not sure. Like, maybe you would consider this in, the Enigmatic Shell as, because, if you end of turn, get it, their stuff comes into play taps, maybe that buys you a turn, and then you get to, hit trigger, sack creature. Yeah, I could see it being good.
Yeah.
Maybe, I don't know if it's, maybe potentially good in Modern, but probably not.
Yeah, I think it's too weird for Modern, I think. Too many of these type lines don't mean anything. Modern is just about a whole different thing these days, I think, than this card is about. It does make me want... one of the dreams of people always is, we do have a good mid-range deck in that format, of course, but everybody always wants to be able to play Abzan, right? It's okay, can we play Siege Rhino with Thalia and that's going to make it awesome suddenly? I don't think so, but I don't know.
Abzan and Pioneer, we could play Siege Rhino.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe we'll go for it. Maybe this will be the card that brings it home, and you get to play Glissa, the new Glissa, Gitrog monster, and Siege Rhino together in some kind of unholy... And with elves, elves are good, so you get to ramp into them, and et cetera, et cetera. But my question for you is, what's a combo card that you want to see most that they haven't put out yet? Do you have thoughts about this?
Well, the one that I want to see the most that's not going to happen is Uroko.
Oh, Uroko.
Uroko.
That would be amazing.
That's just blue, green, ETB, you win the game. Something like that.
Yeah. Oh, God. This is the type of set where Oko is going to come back, though. Oko will be back maybe, or Uro might be... I don't know. Maybe we'll have a completed Oko or Uro. I don't know if you saw the completed Heliod. I didn't think the card was worth talking about right away necessarily, but they have Heliod that turns into a Phyrexia, and I was like, this is what we're doing now? We're going to go... Anyway.
We're just going all over the place.
Yeah, the story always confounds me with Magic a little bit, but it is what it is. The one that I really want to see is Uncle Istvan and Niall Sylvain from the Dark. Let's just have some really old cards. Just put them together. See if anybody remembers.
What about Stang and something? Stang would be a nice one to have Stang. I don't know what you'd put with Stang though.
You put Stang from Legends and the pirate Ramirez de Pietro together. It's just
Stang and Ramirez.
Awesome. All right, and then the last one, Omnath Locus of All. It is white, blue, black Phyrexian, red, green, legendary creature. Phyrexian elemental. So Omnath has been completed, And here's the text of this card. It's a 4/4. It says, if you would lose unspent mana, that mana becomes black instead. At the beginning of your pre-combat main phase, look at the top card of your library. You may reveal that card if it has 3 or more colored mana symbols in its cost. If you do, add 3 mana in any combination of colors and put it into your hand. If you don't reveal it, put it into your hand. That second paragraph...
Hold on, I got lost at black mana. Can you go again?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, here's what it does. At the beginning of your main phase, you get to look at the top card, and if it has 3 mana symbols on it, you basically... So if it's a charm, let's say it's like Jeskai Charm for some reason.
Or Siege Rhino.
Or Siege Rhino. Oh, yeah. Or Siege Rhino. Nailed it. Or Siege Rhino. You get to add the colored mana you need to cast those to your mana pool and then use it. And then if you don't... Either way, you get to draw it. So it's just kind of like saying you get to add the mana to cast it if you want. This is super complicated.
It's a weird one.
Yeah, and the first sentence is if you would lose unspent mana, that mana becomes black. So you just get black mana that just sits in your mana pool forever. Is that what that says?
Yeah. So when I first saw this card, I was thinking about like it's like maybe like a weird wilderness reclamation where if you like have this in play. And then you just have all of your lands on tap, and your opponent doesn't do anything. You just go end step, tap 6 mana, untap, and now I have 6 mana more in my mana pool. So I was thinking about doing maybe some weird thing with that. But yeah, at the end of the day, I feel like it's not that good, but maybe I'm just not understanding it correctly. But like the issue with it, the reveal trigger is like you have to put a lot of 3 mana cards in your deck in order to actually get the mana out of it, which means you're putting a lot of 3-drops in your deck. And putting a lot of 3-drops in your deck kind of sucks.
Yeah. Yeah, mono 3-drop deck is probably not going to work out great for you. That's true. But wow, what a weird card.
Very, very weird.
You see anything else on the list that you thought had potential, or?
I got one here. Well, yeah, I got one. You put the Omnath on there. So this one is Galta and Maverin. Have you seen this one yet?
Yes.
This is the Dinosaur Vampire. So for listeners, it is 3 green, white. 12/12 legendary creature, Dinosaur Vampire. Trample. Whenever you attack, choose one. You can either make a tapped and attacking XX with Trample, where X is your greatest power among other attacking creatures, so not counting itself, or make X11 vampires with lifelink, where X is a number of other attacking creatures. The one reason I wanted to note this, specifically in Pioneer, this is the largest vampire that you can put into play with Sorin Imperious Bloodlord.
Right.
On turn 3. Actually, turn 2 if you play a turn 1 Llanowar. Imagine that. Turn 1 Llanowar, turn 2 Sorin, put this into play.
Why are they doing this to us? That's so funny.
Now, I don't know if that deck's actually good.
And it's not even a black card.
No, it's not a black card. Yeah, I don't know if that's actually good, but I am going to play a lot of that. I'm going to do that a lot. That's what we call
great.
Content.
Because you don't even care about the rest of the text in this case. What you're going to do is you're going to get your 12/12 on turn 3, and then you're going to attack with it on turn 4, and you're going to attack with an elf with it. So you're going to get an extra 1/1 dinosaur creature token, and that's going to be it. But yeah, Galta. That's a cool card. Yeah, I mean, I got to think there's going to be a lot of people trying to figure out how to cheat that one into play, but that Sorin Imperious Bloodlord is already a card that is maybe underplayed in Pioneer as it is, and so I wouldn't be surprised if it becomes a combo piece in that sense, right? Like, Vampires was kind of a deck that was partially there at different points in time, and that sneak attack ability essentially is really good, so why not?
I know people tried to do that Sorin in Modern with the big Changeling guy. Do you remember people trying to do that at one point? I can't remember the name of the Changeling, but it was like, it's like 8 mana for a 10/10 Changeling or something, but basically it's like the biggest thing that you could cheat into play with Sorin. And this just having that kind of stats, even if the ability didn't matter that much, which still might matter, to see what happens. But yeah, I could see it being something.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, I think that was it for me for now.
I got one more for the listeners. This is a personal favorite. This is Yargle and Multani. Seen this one?
Yes.
So this one's very, very complicated, okay? So pay attention, listeners. This is 3 black, green. So 6 mana. I'll read you the text box. The text box is, I've heard much about you from my daughter, Multani rumbled. There was a time when I'd balk at your aid, Phantom, but she has shown me the merit in Urborg's strange ways. And then it says, Ginshki Pribit replied Yargle, and 18/6 is the stats. That's the whole card, so very complicated.
Yeah, 6 CMC, 18/6. I can't wait to cast
awesome
this when I
flavor
have Risen Reef out, so it actually does something other than coming into play.
Pandemonium, anybody?
Oh yeah. What is up with two of these like keystone cards from this set being frogs? By the way,
I know, right?
Do you see that coming? Not really.
Yeah, Frog's spirit elemental is Yargle and Multani.
So someone in the chat was telling me that this is the first vanilla creature to be in standard in like 18 months. Is Yargle.
Really?
Supposedly.
Wow, I didn't think about that, but yeah, that's probably right. They really don't print vanillas anymore.
Yeah.
Wow.
So the joke with this one is just it's two Yargles, right? It's double Yargle.
Double Yargles.
Yeah.
Because Multani doubles things, and
I mean, does Multani double things? That's what I couldn't figure out. Okay.
The original Multani, let me pull it up here. Power and toughness equal to the number of cards in all players' hands, so it counts yours and your opponent. So it's kind of like double.
Right. Oh, all players' hands. Yep. There you go. I mean, this card just being 18 power could be a thing for somebody, right? Like it could. I don't know what format we're talking about here, but like you said, Pandemonium hit someone for 18.
Thud? Any thuds?
Yeah. All right. Well, I think that's gonna close us off for today. We couldn't ask for a better way to end than with Yargle and Multani, and with Devon trying to pronounce whatever it is Yargle is saying. Devon, why don't you let everybody know where they can find you?
You can find me at twitch.tv/DoomWake, Twitter, YouTube, all of that stuff. DoomWake is d00mwake, streaming Monday through Thursday, 2 to 9 Eastern, except for today. We went until 8, and then Friday, 12 to 5 Eastern. So thank you.
Awesome. Well, really excited to have you on the show again. It was a lot of fun. I appreciate you coming in to cover for those two guys who just didn't show up today somehow. So appreciate you fitting us in after your long weekend for sure. That wraps up this week's show. If you haven't yet, make sure you subscribe to our podcast so you get the latest episodes as soon as they come out. And if you use Apple Podcasts, please leave us a rating and review. If you'd like to submit a question to the podcast or reach out, you can tweet at us at the Dive Down, all one word, or email the Dive Down at gmail.com. If you would like to support the show, you can check out our Patreon at patreon.com/thedivedown, and also check out our store at thedivedown.com/store. Also shout out to manatraders.com for supporting the Dive Down. Sign up for Mana Traders using promo code the Dive Down 10, all one word, for 10% off your first 2 months of renting Magic Online cards. And finally, get some amazing shaving products, soaps, body soaps, fragrances, and more at Barrister and Man using the Dive Down 15 for 15% off your first order. And then finally, check out Nerd Rage Gaming for 8% off of your paper cards with the code DIVE8. As always, special thanks to the bands Nowhere and Space Blood for letting us use their music. And until next week, get out there and say whatever Yargle says.